Okay, so I probably waded in way too deep last week with some sort of foundational things and historical things and trying to do East and West, so I'll probably make the same mistake tonight, but I won't try to spend so much time with that. We'll try to get on to some more kind of practical things in terms of the mystery of confession. So just by way of a little bit of recap, which is a good thing to do, remember that in the East, the rite developed not as a court or trial, but as a place to receive medicine for healing from the physician. And that physician is, in fact, the priest confessor. There is no stress on the power of the keys, but it is nonetheless presupposed in Orthodox teaching, which insists that the priest must know what the sins are before he can exercise the power of binding and loosing by prescribing the right medicine. Just for a little by here, I've been thinking I wish I could do it again, because I'm not a very good Antiochian anymore, I'm afraid. I'm struggling terribly. So in the old days, when I was the priest here, I flew out to Los Angeles, where Bishop Basil was the priest on the bishop on the West Coast. We actually spent 2 full days out around the swimming pool mostly. It was lovely February weather out there. And I still have my notes on a yellow legal pad that I took. So I learned just everything. But I remember he told me that you will sometimes encounter in our archdiocese people who will approach you as the priest and just go like this.
On their own head or on yours?
Their own head, yeah. That means they just want you to say the prayer of absolution.
Yeah, they don't want to make confession.
That's right. After I moved from Alaska to New York, I was covering a parish. I won't name which one. That summer, I was very popular, actually, for covering parishes. And I'm serving Orthros. I'm in the holy place, and I heard, and I thought, I don't know what that is. So immediately, a sort of daughtery old subdeacon came in and said, Abuna, they're waiting for you to make their confession. They're here for confession. I heard it again. So it just happened that the design of the place, they had a doorbell. And when people were over there wanting absolution, they pressed the doorbell. And that meant the priest could stop what he's doing in Orthros and come. And guess what? Just put the Epitrihili over their head and say the prayer. So I had an entire family. And I remember Bishop Basil saying, don't do that. People will expect that, and there are plenty of priests who do that, but don't do that. Because what I just said here, I can't absolve nothing. So anyway, I kind of upset that family because I said, I got to break you all up, and I got to take you one at a time. And I remember coaching them through all of that. Okay, I point that out to you because you've all been at different places. You know, I got in hot water with Michelle. I sent her somewhere, and it wasn't what I thought. By the way, I have spoken to the priest in Topeka, and he was a little surprised too, because he hadn't caught up with whatever the new moves are from the old place. So whatever's going on there. And here I'm being recorded now. But anyway, so I put that out because that's there, okay? So in contrast to what I've just said, the sort of elaborate penances designed to fit the crime, as I said last week, developed in the West, they're actual manuals. Some of them are like this thick that allow you to sort of, match the crime to the punishment. So in Orthodoxy, the priest is given a lot of discretion as to what is appropriate for the person making his or her confession. In fact, there is much divergence of practice found amongst priests. Okay? So that's just a fact, all right? I can remember, I had it, I think with the Pendles, and I had it with the Carabinuses, who in the early days, you were visiting Kansas City, I think, and maybe you went to St. George or something.
Yes.
And the children were congratulated, and you were congratulated because you made your communion. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. With the Carabinuses, they were so surprised because by the time they got up there to make their communion, the priest had left and closed the doors and the curtain. That's because those are non-communicating parishes for the most part, except for little tiny children. So it is the same with trying to get, I don't know what, the sort of model, roadmap for everybody. So I'm giving you the kind of broader perspective here, all right? And what I'm saying is, for the most part, now becoming more and more the standardized practice. But who knows? So I think that another important distinction is to whom the confession is made. The rites in the West begin with the words, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." That's the direction, okay? In our tradition, we don't have that juridical character of confession. We're often even standing before an icon of the crucified Lord, or the wise thief. In this case, it's the wonderful Sinai icon of Christ, which is there in the place where most people make their confessions. So again, in Orthodoxy, the confession is made to Jesus Christ. The first words spoken to the person confessing are as follows: "My brother, my sister, inasmuch as thou hast come to God and to me, be not ashamed, for thou speakest not unto me, but unto God before whom thou standest." There is another common form which you may find if you're confessing to a priest other than me, which would be this one: "Behold, my child, Christ is invisibly present to receive your confession. Therefore do not be ashamed or afraid, and conceal nothing from me, but tell me without equivocation what you have done. So you shall have pardon from the Lord Jesus Christ. See, his image is before us. I am only a witness to bear testimony before him. But if you conceal anything from me, you will have double sin. So take care, since you come for medicine, lest you go away unhealed." There. That ought to scare the bejeebers out of you, right?
I really love that.
Well, I'll use it next time with you. How's that? Okay. There you go. Yes. Now, again, a little bit of a side. I was once told by my then confessor that if I end up in hell as a priest, it's going to be because I over-identify with my penitence. Penitence, I misspoke. Penitence. People coming to me for confession. I've told you before, your sins are my sins, and so I have that. But I'm also extremely cautious about what I call the probing clergy. And there have been some real problems in Orthodoxy with the probers. I mean, it's one thing to make your confession to a real clairvoyant who, stops you making your confession and they finish it for you. I know that experience. Can I explain that? I cannot, other than that we live in a church for which there are real sanctified, holy people who have that gift, that charism. But many times people going to certain monasteries have been sort of stunned as the probing carries on, and then they walk away with a penance not to approach the chalice for 25 years or something. And guess what? If you are given that penance, and then you come back to me, your parish priest, or whoever your parish priest is, we can't lift that. Only a bishop can lift that if it's another priest, okay? So, these words from the Orthodox Christian rite of confession that I've just read, both models, show the sharp contrast that is to be found between East and West, both theologically and I think maybe more significantly pastorally. When looking at the history of this mystery, the abuses that developed in the West, as cited above, no doubt contributed to the eventual rejection of confession or penance as a sacramental rite by the Protestant reformers in the West. So, for the purpose of completing this kind of historical survey, which we started last week, of confession, I'm going to give you a kind of brief, skimming the top of other traditions. And I always have to say this when I'm doing this. I'm not picking on your poor Lutheran grandma, okay, or your Methodist favorite auntie. I'm just pointing this out for you so you have a better understanding of who you and what you are. We don't have any comment about other houses except our own for which we are responsible. And we can do that best when we understand the environment in which we're trying to witness our orthodoxy. We're clear on that? Okay. So Martin Smith, SSJ, Society of St. John the Evangelist, which is an Episcopalian monastic community, in his book on confession, which was written to help Episcopalians prepare for confession, there's that famous saying of Queen Victoria when she was asked about Anglicans and confession. She said, "Some do, most don't, all should." There you go. So, Martin Smith reminds us that Martin Luther held this. Luther regarded as a sacrament, along with baptism and the Eucharist, making your confession. And he affirmed the authority of ministers to absolve sin. He removed the obligation to use private confession and abolished the traditional imposition of penance. For Luther, penances obscured the free and unconditional character of God's mercy with their suggestion that humans can offset their guilt by their deeds. The penitence part in reconciliation is to exhibit a living faith, not to make satisfaction for sin. Now, here's the rub. Almost universally, Luther's followers rejected his teaching on this, and it just simply disappeared. But in the 1978 American Lutheran Book of Worship, they did include an order of individual confession and forgiveness. So there's a whole big gap of history where Lutherans don't have it, but in very modern times, they saw the worthiness of doing something, okay? So John Calvin, if you're looking at the Calvinist tradition, especially Presbyterians, I once asked a Presbyterian minister how she got along with certain teachings of John Calvin, and I loved her answer. She said, "I ignore them." So there you go. So John Calvin rejected the idea of confession as a quote-unquote sacrament altogether. He did promote and help to restore public penances in Geneva. And I've already talked about public penances, very humiliating. And the problem is that it caused other people to sin because they were taking such delight in basically kicking the backside of these people, okay? So remember, in Calvin's view, a pastor was the most appropriate person to hear a confession, but as he said, but it's totally unnecessary. So the other prominent continental reformer was Zwingli. That one's tied to the Anabaptist, the Baptist tradition, who saw frequent confession to God as being part of being a good Christian. This is his quote. But confession to another Christian, except for the purpose of advice, is of no particular value. Okay? So that's why all of that's there. That's also why, I mentioned to some of you my encounter recently with an elderly convert to Orthodoxy who has grandchildren, in her case, who are terribly concerned about her salvation all of a sudden. Because, what's the point of confession? Okay, well, if you're in that tradition, follow your teaching of your founder, Zwingli. We're following the tradition of our founder, whose name is Jesus Christ, if that rings a bell. Okay, we have no human founder that Orthodoxy can trace itself to. It's not there, okay? So, have at it. All right, and then, of course, you've got the various prayer books that were developing at the time of the English Reformation, and the 1549 prayer book maintained the right of confession and absolution as part of visitation of the sick. But that was a short-lived one, and things did not prevail. So it was found there. And then, of course, with the Oxford Revival beginning in 1833, there was a kind of what I would call the watchful eye towards the Church of Rome and their practice. So several adaptations were made that began to find its way into Anglican ethos, Anglican piety. And many Anglo-Catholics began to teach that the sacrament was required of all, and this created tensions that held until a more ecumenical era. And that era was, of course, what? Vatican II. And so with the documents of Vatican II, which brought sweeping revision and all the liturgical aspects of life in the Roman Catholic Church, brought a change to which I heard with my own ears. Cardinal Timothy Dolan of New York, saying that one of the things that has been quite stressful, particularly in the late 70s, the 80s, and even in the early 90s, is confession was like disappearing in the Latin tradition. But there is a revival, particularly amongst Gen Zs and some others, and so it's also seeing something that's coming upward, okay? So I'll stop there, and I'll pause. Any clarifications on any traditions that aren't part of this big umbrella here? Okay? All right, so that's to help us understand who we are. So here's a great quote, I think, from the late, great proto-presbyter Alexander Schmemann. Now, he was an observer at Vatican II, by the way. He was an Orthodox observer. And I'm always amused when certain people will say, well, he was totally taken with the Second Vatican Council, and that's why he did all this change in the Orthodox Church. He was not an innovationist. He didn't bring new things. In fact, he was very, very suspicious of it all. But he was a restorationist. He restored things that we lost. But when he was asked about the various revisions and renewals that were out there and beginning to creep into the teaching of the Orthodox Church, because plenty of Orthodox people had their eye on what was happening in the Church of Rome. And Father Schmemann answered it this way. He said, what do we need to have a revision or a renewal in the Orthodox Church? He said, nothing. We need only to begin. Everything is already there. Pretty good, right? Not bad. So, I also think that we're living in a time of great spiritual needs. That's being demonstrated just at every turn. Lots of people seeking here and there and everywhere, many of them seeking outside of any kind of Christian tradition. But I think that people are, thanks largely to the rise of modern psychiatry and psychology, much, much more open to the concept of, well, bearing one's soul to another human being. That's a change that was really not there in the 60s and the 70s, when all of those liturgical changes and theological discourses were happening in the Church of Rome. So the idea of disclosing deep and often painful secrets is now an accepted part of the ever-growing counseling that people are seeking in various therapy movements and whatever. It was really begun last century, but it's become much, much more prominent in more recent decades. So I think that it's very important that the Christian Church not abdicate the unique role that the gospel demands of us who are called to heal in the name of Jesus Christ. So the whole concept, I would say, of Orthodoxy regaining, as Father Schmemann would help us to realize, the idea of the church as hospital, a place of healing, and using this mystery as part of what is administered in the church to those who need that kind of healing touch. And it is a recognition that we just simply bear forth what is in fact the gift of Jesus Christ himself to you and to me. And it's within the context of the mysteries of the church, and the mysteries of the church do what for us? They bring us a real experience in which we can approach these mysteries with a sure and certain faith. We know that this is what we say that it is. Okay? Yeah, 600 are now, and 600 are visiting Salina, getting training. That's a lot. Okay? All right. So I want to say very briefly, watching before everybody collapses, because last night was not a good night to sleep, having sirens and whatever else going off all over the place. This is what's called the seal of the confession. Okay. When I was a seminarian 1,000 years ago, I put my name in the hat for a drawing, and I won a full set of what we called affectionately as seminarians Daddy Hall's, I think 8 volumes of doctrine. They were a paperback edition. They usually came out, hardbound, but somebody did a cheap paperback edition. I put my name in the hat and I won it. And I thought, boy, I really had a treasure. I still have it. It's on my library shelf, and I find it useful because he was, as an Anglican priest in Texas, really pretty solid. But he came up with certain exceptions to the seal, okay? And his exceptions, there were 3 of them. He said, A, if the priest has personal knowledge of what is confessed outside the confessional, then he's free. If he had personal knowledge outside of the rite of confession. In other words, he already knew it.
How do you mean he's free? What do you mean that he's free?
Then he can break the seal.
Okay.
Because he knows it outside of the rite. Okay? The second one is when the good of others can be promoted and the penitent freely consents, the seal may be broken for such good, but no further. Okay? Remind me if I slip here in my dotage to come back to this one, because I will tell you my own practice and how I operate in a very kind of modern context of this. Okay? The third one, he said, was when the confession clearly reveals intention to commit in the future a crime that endangers others. All right. So he came up with 3 exceptions. Very Anglican, he just sort of came up with all of this, and answering, no doubt, his parishioners' questions about it all. All right. I, of course, was trained in a tradition in which the seal of the confession is absolute, period. Period, period. Okay? So that was drilled into our heads. So I'm personal friends with the former Episcopalian Bishop of the Diocese of Eau Claire in Wisconsin, Bishop William Wantland. He still remains a good friend, and he's an attorney by training. In fact, he continues to function. He's retired now, but he is the judge for the Seminole Nation. He's a member of the Seminole Nation in Oklahoma. So as a canonist, he wrote this opinion. Most canonists recognize the exception to the rule of the seal where the penitent grants the confessor the right to discuss the subject of the confession with the penitent after the confession has been made. Okay? This exception has become common practice in Eastern Christian contexts, especially when the priest and penitent have a relationship of spiritual direction. I nearly lost what hair I have left when I discovered this, because I'm so formed and drilled in that it must be absolute. And I remember in class when I was doing doctoral work going at it with the now late Father Joseph Allen, who was so shocked that I would never do that. He said, do you mean to tell me that if you heard one of your parishioners' confession and you could see that it was becoming a problem again, you wouldn't approach them and say, you remember you said to me in confession X, Y, and Z, to help them sort of circle back to it and take it up again? I said, absolutely not. So he thought that was odd. Do you know who saved me? All of my former Episcopal priest brothers who were in that group. We all said, no. And I think I probably told you this story before. I'll repeat it because it's the privilege of old age. I think at Nashotah House we were well prepared to hear our parishioners' confessions in a Western context, but we were well prepared. But I was still a little bit uncomfortable. In our first parish in Denver, we had an 80-something retired priest um, whose parish in New Jersey, by the way, the name of it was St. Anthony of Padua. Yeah, how about that for an Episcopal church? So that tells you what kind of Episcopal church it was. They outdid the Romans down the street in anything they did. So I knew he had heard gazillions of confessions in his time as the parish priest there. So we arranged to have sherry or something like that. I may have asked to come for tea, and I think he served sherry. It was delightful. But he told me, he says, in hearing confessions, he said, you will hear every single sin imaginable, with the possible exception of murder, and you're going to hear that one in some context. Maybe not an actual murder, but people who have said, I've thought of killing my sister many times, or whatever, okay? Well, as it turned out, I actually heard the confession of a Vietnam vet, and that was on his list. So that was important. He also said to me that all priests are granted the grace of forgetfulness if they avail themselves to it. And he said, pray frequently that God will allow you to cultivate and maintain that gift. Well, I can tell you, I stand before God and the holy icons here. If you were to come up to me and say, do you remember when I told you in confession last month? I have no idea what you said. No idea. And I will actually look at you and say, no, I don't, and I don't want to hear about it. Because it's the seal. So the same happens to a layperson, by the way. If you happen to, by accident, I don't think anybody do this intentionally, but what do I know? You happen to hear something, overhear something, you're under the same seal. You're not allowed to discuss it, raise it, or even come up and talk about it. You can't come up and say, well, I'm sorry, Billy Bob, but I heard what you did to Mary Lou. Can't do that. Why? Well, it actually will contribute to another sin. That's a very good point, actually. But Billy Bob is making his confession to whom? To God, okay? So that's where it's been directed, not to your overhearing ears, okay? God forgives and I forgive. There you go, okay? So, I'm pointing this out to you because I have also since talked to some very respected canonists in the Orthodox Church, some of whom I marvel at their work as canonists. They fall where your priest is on this. There is nothing that would allow you to break the seal. Now, we have mandatory reporting now laws, okay, especially involving pedophilia, those kinds of things in the sexual realm. And I had to work with seminarians now for a long time, and for me, and I've checked this with other candidates, and they said if I don't like the term, but if I actually abort the confession at the right moment, if I see where it's going, that actually ends the rite. And even with that, I will then say to the person, if you are sincere in seeking forgiveness, this is what must be done. I have twice offered to go to actually, with the penitent, to actually report. One time the person said no, but they went, and the other time I went with them. So it's not like I have an abundance of experience in all of this. And I don't want any more, but, I'm doing what parish priests do and what I did in another role. So that kind of answered one of the questions that I said I needed to come back to like that. Am I clear with you on that? Does that make sense?
You gave us that man's writing saying 3 exceptions, but you're saying that we really don't have any.
We don't have any. No. But I don't have to, there are two things. I don't have to finish the rite. If I think this is going where need not be going, I can put a stop on it. The other thing is, nothing requires me to grant absolution. Would I withhold absolution? I have.
If the person is truly penitent, you might.
Yes. But on very rare occasions, I've given terms. And that's, again, part of the healing process. I think that that's the best way to get them to do what needs to be done for them to actually find healing in their soul. Well, for instance, if someone says to me in confession that they've hated their brother for 25 years, and I get the whole kind of picture, but it's pretty clear they ain't interested in forgiveness. They're interested in carrying the grudge. I may well say, I want you to go and call your brother. And if she then says, I've tried that, and he just hangs up, I say, well, that's fine. You've at least made the attempt. And so the sin is now in his court, not yours. And when you've done that, you can come back and say to me, Father, I did it. Tell me what happened. And if he hung up, fine. But if not, you're going to plan to meet at some point and unpack 25 years of garbage that's kept you at odds. Marvelous. Then come and we'll have absolution. And we'll sing with the angels who are rejoicing in heaven.
So would that be the same situation if you had someone who was confessing something that was a mandate reporting type situation?
Yeah.
You would stop and say, let me walk you through how what the terms are going to be. Did you repeat the question?
Okay. Michelle is asking if in the confession I sense something that's required by mandatory reporting. Hopefully I have enough wherewithal that I see where that's going, and I'll stop. And then we'll have a little conversation. I find not just with mandatory reporting things, but sometimes those kind of delicate things, for the most part, people wouldn't bring it up if they really didn't want to set it right.
So that's my question. So there's a term or condition.
Yeah. So it's either you're going to need to go to the police station now and report this, and I'm happy to go with you if you need that kind of courage and moral support. Yeah. Or if not, and I'm going to follow up, which is what I did the one time I had that. Yeah. Here's another one. I'm watching the clock. It's not 9 yet, right? Okay. In the Latin Church, that sort of absolute seal of confession also kind of applies to absolutely marriage must be kept intact, period, no matter what the situation is, right? I state that fairly? So if you have a case of domestic abuse and it comes up in confession, you're supposed to work at preserving that marriage at all costs, right? Am I correct? Yes, okay. And if there is a divorce, what's the response?
Are you asking Orthodox response?
No, the Latin Church. I'm trying to get the Latin Church out here. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's why now with Pope Francis, there's a lot of talk about, well, is it time to address this one? Okay. So, in our Orthodox tradition, this may well come up in confession. And this is the other thing I do as a priest. Um, I will often say to a person making their confession, this is very significant. We're going to continue the rite. You're going to be granted absolution, but I need to see you either later this evening or tomorrow so we can continue this one. Okay? And that's often a case of some kind of domestic violence or abuse, or sometimes it's actually not a physical abuse at all. It could sometimes be, kind of mental tormenting and other such things. In Orthodoxy, we recognize that because of sin, marriages do fall apart. They dissolve. And so rather than pretend otherwise, again, for healing and pastoral care, we just simply have to acknowledge that. And that means that actually both parties, if they're both Orthodox and are going to continue, have to acknowledge that. And there is a period, sometimes of penance, depending on the situation. It's not always and not automatic. Sometimes, pastorally, you may have to pick up things like that and actually help. It could be the husband, but it's generally the wife. Get out of the situation and into a safe house. And if they're kids, the same thing. All of that evolves around what's happening in terms of the healing and pastoral process. All right? We're good with that? It's the same with an alcohol intervention. Okay? If you recognize it's in confession, yes, okay, it's going to stay in confession. It's the seal. But almost always that raises its head outside of confession in a pastoral manner. And again, I've done it more times than I really want to, the actual intervention in my role as a priest in getting somebody who needs to get to treatment to get there. My classic one was probably in Kodiak. Our former parishioner here, Paul, I won't use the surname, you'll remember. He was my academic dean at St. Herman's, and we had a situation where one of our deacons was plastered in a bar, and I got the call, so I drove back to the seminary. The two of us went to the bar. We had to stand really burly, and neither one of us are like, big burly guys, I guess. But we had to be big and burly and say to the guys who wanted to say, leave him the heck alone. And we said, no, he's going with us. So we got him back to the seminary. And we found actually where his stash was. It was up under ceilings like this, by the way. And he said, well, I'm just going back as soon as you're gone. And I said, well, actually, you won't. And we went out, and I said to another student, I need your hunting knife. And he had it right there, and I flattened all 4 tires. And he was too drunk to walk, okay? Those are the kinds of things that will actually come out of what? Spiritual direction and the formation of people, getting them right so they can actually make a clean and good confession. And those kinds of things are needed.
I thought you were going to say you drove him to treatment, but you didn't.
No, and he had successive periods in treatment, and thanks be to God, it worked. And he's a very fine priest now. Fine priest. Okay? So, that's a significant thing because there's still lots of people who are nervous about the seal and all the rest. There was a book that I liked very much in my first term here. It was written by Metropolitan Emilianos. It was a book called Priest, Parish, and Renewal. Some people went like this with the word renewal, but I got it. We're not talking about Protestant revival. He said this: a sinner, then, is not acting nor existing authentically, nor is he or she acting nor existing wisely. A sinner needs to be turned around, that is, reoriented, revitalized, and is in constant need of healing. This has always been one of the Church's basic therapeutic ministries, though for many parishioners it has often been confined to a narrow, simplistic matter of absolution. So you got that part? Okay, part of that is our own history in Orthodoxy, where, again, Father Schmemann is the one who separated making your confession and making your communion. I've actually heard people's confessions on Saturday night, and they didn't come to approach the chalice on Sunday morning at liturgy. You know why? No, I had a bad thought this morning while I was brushing my teeth. A bad thought this morning while I was brushing my teeth. That is simply ridiculous. But it's kind of like the Pantals going to Kansas City and being congratulated because they made communion. Did people give the kids money?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, see, there you go. I like that part. Yeah. I might introduce that here. What do you think?
No.
Huh? Oh, why not? All right. So, in the closing minutes here, I think it's important to recognize that in so many ways we have not yet begun to prepare for confession, each one of us. I hear your confessions, I make my confession, but already our souls hear the temptation, should I put it off? Can I wait? Maybe next time around? People wrestle interiorly as they're preparing for confession with so many temptations such as, am I sufficiently prepared? Well, you know, I really didn't fast so well, and is that really a big deal or not? And do I really need to say it? You all know these things. So if you come to serve the Lord, prepare yourself for temptations. That's just as simple as it is, and that comes from Ecclesiasticus chapter 2, verse 1. So if you have decided to make this special act of preparation, you must expect to encounter many obstacles, interior and exterior, but they vanish as soon as you show firmness in your intention and you make your Stavros. Okay, you make the sign of the cross. So in the last couple of minutes here, which isn't fair, but I can pick it up next week in the Q&A time if you want, how to prepare, okay? I'll say three things. One, in this parish, we have that very nice little purple brochure thing. It helps you go through, but don't make it a checklist like, this one, this one. You got to think through about why am I checking this? How does it apply to me? And that's what you're actually bringing to confession, okay? There are people who simply can look at the 10 Commandments and go through and say, in this way I have violated these things. But again, not like a checklist saying, well, Father, I did all 10 of the commandments. Okay? That does not show that you've had a sort of in-depth interior look. Now, I have also done this. I may have done it to some of you over the years. I've had people who are really struggling to actually make a good confession, and I will ask them to ask their spouse, their husband, or their wife, or their children, or even co-workers to help you prepare for confession. Seraphima likes that one. Yeah.
Be careful what you ask.
There you go.
I don't dare ask email.
Yeah. Oh, my dear, I'm so glad you asked. Exactly. Well, there you go. So I think that's a good way to sort of conclude. As I said, we all had a disturbing night last night. But you can say things, if you ruminate on things and come up with some, ask Abuna questions for next week or gotcha questions or any of those things, we can take it up. But I hope this gives you a good foundation for what's in fact one of the mysteries of the Church that some people absolutely are fearful of. And no reason to be fearful. I've told you, and I'll repeat it many times, your sins are not unique, and your sins are my sins. So, and don't think you can shock me. beyond all that. Okay, thank you for your endurance. Thank you for your presence. Thank you for putting up with me in my dotage. It was better after food. I improved.